Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Since at least the 1980s, we've talked about the so-called evangelical vote. My guests are here to help us understand what motivates evangelicals to become so involved in the political process and how they might influence the 2016 election. Please meet James Hastings and Stephen Young. Welcome, gentlemen. Jim, let me start with you. Even though we hear a lot about the evangelical vote and evangelicals in America, I'm not sure everybody's operating with the same definition of who evangelicals are and what they believe. Could you maybe articulate for me your definition of an evangelical Christian?
I'll do the best I can, Ozzie.
Okay.
My idea of evangelical Christian is simply that, a Christian. They believe that the Bible was inspired by God, was written by men who were inspired by God. They believe in they believe in God and His Son. Basically, just core religious beliefs if you're a Protestant Christian.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of scholars who study this have a hard time, really, as you suggested, differentiating between what evangelicals believe as opposed to mainstream Christians. And if there is any differentiation, it tends to be a little bit fuzzy. Stephen, you have anything to kind of add to that?
Well, exactly as you said, Ozzie, one of the issues with studying evangelicals as scholars is that, and you hinted at this, Jim, is that it's a term that's not just used by scholars, but it's used by people who identify as evangelicals. And since people disagree with each other, they oftentimes will disagree about what the term means. They can disagree in the sense of just different people who identify as evangelicals will think different things are important, or they can disagree in the sense of one group will actually want to claim the term for themselves and deny it to others. So that, of course, makes it sort of a mess when scholars want to go study the term, because we want to have a term that enables us to try to describe.
Objective, yes.
Well, it's not so much objective as we want a term that enables us to get some kind of, how do I put this? A purchase on the situation that's not just limited by one contested or debated viewpoint, but that lets us include the entire debate,
right,
and then draw some conclusions or observations based on that. But yes, it's...
Is there anything to the term being born again that is exclusive to evangelicals? Does that in any way differentiate evangelicals from other mainstream Christians? That is, having the conversion experience. Is that unique to evangelicals?
It can, but it's not mutually exclusive. There are lots of people who are not evangelicals who certainly have been born again Christians. That's just having as Wesley said, you're having another experience. You're I say, struggling towards perfection. He said that we might reach perfection before we die. Probably not, but you're always moving towards perfection. I say struggling towards perfection because I struggle with my faith all the time. Mm-hmm. You know, we all do. We all sin.
So it's not just the conversion experience that's important, but it's what is subsequent to that as well. The task of trying to live a holy life or a good life post-conversion that also marks an evangelical, I guess.
Yeah, you know, it's all so confusing. People in this country are so confused, as am I, about some religious beliefs and what exactly people practice. But you know, there are plenty of people who are good people that practice all the things that we consider to be Christian values that are not Christian. There are also lots of people who are professing Christians who perhaps don't live exactly the way we think they should live. Yeah. So even the mainstream church, pews, congregations, they don't understand the word evangelical. It's a mystical word to them for some reason. Would you say so, Stephen?
Again, yes, to many people, because you could talk to many people whom we as scholars might say, when I study evangelicals or write an article about them, this is who I'm writing about. And yes, plenty of those people would not have heard of the term evangelical before. But part of the issue here is what both of y'all have gotten at, is that we sort of identify a cluster, or the common way of identifying evangelicals is you pick a cluster of issues, like people who claim that being born again is important, the identification of the Bible as the Word of God, the necessity of not just being born again, but it being a personal decision that you make. And so we'll focus on those issues. And yes, so some people will just say, well, that's Christian. Some people will say, this makes me evangelical. One thing I like to add to this mixture, though, is that there are other sort of commitments that many people who are evangelicals have that we often lose sight of when we focus just on what we might call the religious issues.
Right.
So for example, if you look at the history of evangelicalism, there's been a deep commitment to what we might call traditional marriage, traditional sexual morality, traditional ideas about gender. Those would be the terms that are oftentimes used by evangelicals.
Would you consider these sorts of things? So I think we're going off in a slightly different direction here. So we got the kind of core theological beliefs that we talked about, faith issues. And now it sounds like we're kind of describing evangelical commitments in terms of social issues, the commitment to the traditional family, for example, and other issues that might come along with that.
Well, yes, but this is where we can also fall into a trap, because whereas we as outside observers might distinguish between these as being social issues versus theological issues, for many evangelicals themselves, those are not separate issues. They're fundamentally joined together.
Would you agree with that, Jim? That these kind of
Pretty much,
yeah.
I would, yeah. The going back to the born again thing, Ozzie, you know, there are people like me that I was raised in the Methodist Church. I was always a Christian in my mind. Did the right thing, served on the right boards, taught Sunday school, all those things that you would think that Christians do that are living a good life. But yet I was not a true Christian. I had not accepted Christ in the truest form until 1998. And so I was born again in 1998, which simply means that you discover that if you have to ask, are you a Christian, then you aren't.
And that's one of the things I think that evangelicals often point to is a specific time when they can.
Oh, mine was dramatic.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, God got my attention quickly.
All right, let's move this on a little bit. I think one of the things we've discovered here is that term is hard to pin down.
Hard to describe.
It's hard to describe. But I think we have a pretty good common understanding of evangelical Christians. Now, in the past elections, since perhaps the Reagan years, it was pretty clear that evangelical voting commitments tended to line up with a candidate who seemed to reflect some of those commitments. I'm wondering if this time around it's a little more complicated than that. Jim, you're working, you're the chair actually for the North Carolina Great America PAC, so you're working closely with Trump supporters. In fact, I think you were at an event yesterday.
I was.
I'm interested to know, do evangelical voters this time around see in Donald Trump someone who reflects their values, faith and social issue commitments, or is there another kind of attraction here? And it's pretty clear now that the majority, at least of white evangelicals, say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. So what's the attraction here? Is it the same as in the past? Do they see shared commitments with Trump? I'm wondering.
All those fuzzy things that Stephen talked about that's hard to pin down. Patriotism, love of country, belief in core values, family, one man, one woman, marriage between men and women. They see those things in Trump. Now, they don't see all those things in him, but they see more of those things in him than they do Hillary Clinton.
Okay. So in some sense, maybe there's a weaker kind of positive correlation between their beliefs and those beliefs they see Trump standing for this time around, and a little bit more of the kind of comparative analysis between how much Trump brings to the table as compared to Hillary Clinton. But is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
You know, he went to Liberty and spoke to D.C. and spoke to the evangelical gathering up there. It was about 400 people. But when you have people like Tony Robbins, when you have people like Falwell, when you have people Dobson, all those people were there, questioned him pretty heavily, and came out with an endorsement for him.
Right.
So a lot of people are going to support him because of the support of people like that. They're going to let other people influence their vote.
Okay. Stephen, we were talking earlier, I think you've read a couple of interesting articles kind of analyzing this situation. what do you see from the side of commentators and critics who are coming at this from a scholarly perspective? How are they analyzing this attraction of Donald Trump among evangelicals?
Well, there are two ways I've seen it primarily analyzed, and y'all have hit on one of them already. It's that you have many people who pollsters identify as evangelicals who say they're voting for Trump, and they'll oftentimes, I forget the percentage, but a large percentage of them say we're voting for the lesser of two evils. So that, of course, is not so much, as you said, a positive endorsement, but they're choosing not to vote for someone they think is more problematic.
Right.
On the other side, this goes back to the point I brought up earlier. I think, at least when it comes to endorsements by well-respected, within the evangelical world, well-respected evangelical leaders, some of them are laying out their own logic for why they would endorse Trump. So, for example, Wayne Grudem, who is the founder of the, I believe it's called the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It was a council that was, or a think tank that was designed precisely to promote what they would consider to be traditional marriage, traditional ideas about gender. He has a piece that he posted about why voting for Trump is a morally good choice. And what he outlines quite explicitly is reasons that a Donald Trump presidency, whether it's through the Supreme Court justices he may get to appoint, or whether it's through other policies of his, reasons why a Trump presidency will further the cause of traditional marriage or traditional morality or traditional ideas about gender as evangelicals define it. Grudem thinks Trump will further that. Grudem thinks that Secretary Clinton will be, an obstacle to his goals on that front. And so Grudem strongly endorses Trump from that perspective, but is at the same time very open about how his endorsement of Trump is not necessarily an endorsement of Trump's personal religious beliefs.
That's interesting. And I think you've touched on several things here that I'd like to kind of reflect back on both of you. I believe that Trump is a member of the Presbyterian Church, a large Presbyterian congregation in New York. But how his faith necessarily spills over into his public life is not always explicit or explicitly demonstrated. And there was a couple of other things that caught my attention, and maybe both of you could comment on this. I think Donald Trump has had a history of being pro-choice to a certain degree. And I believe it was MSNBC, which among mainstream media might be considered toward the left, actually identified Donald Trump as the most LGBT friendly of the Republican candidates. So those are a couple of things that may, in my mind at least, seems to be out of sync with what we've described here as evangelical emphasis on traditional values. Jim, do you have any insight?
No, you're exactly right, Ozzie, as far as the LGBT thing, the pro-choice. He's changed his views on pro-choice.
That's
he
right.
now says that he's pro-life. But those things bother evangelicals. They bother lots of people who aren't evangelicals. But it's just as we say in the Methodist Church, ours is a big tent, but it's not a circus tent. So they are willing to overlook some of the things because, none of us agree with whatever philosophy we pursue 100%. We don't agree with everything that our particular civic club or our particular church or our particular department in the university. We don't believe 100%. I mean, if we did, we'd all be robots. There'd be no need for minds. Yeah. So they're willing to overlook those things. But
do you think, Jim, you've been amongst Trump supporters now for a few months. Do you feel a real enthusiasm among people hold evangelical beliefs, or do you feel like they're coming to Trump grudgingly in any sense? Or?
No, not the people I'm with, but you got to understand people who talk to me know that I'm a Trump supporter. So a lot of times you only get, the thing that's been most encouraging to me, and I really believe in my heart of hearts that Donald Trump's going to be the next president. I wear the Trump cap, and I was at a barbecue joint in Asheville last week just to eat, and I had probably 10 people, just people that you think they're just working people, come up to my table and do this and say, I'm afraid to come out and say that I'm for Donald Trump because I don't want my car to get keyed, or I don't want my neighbor to make fun of me. He's tapped into what Nixon's silent majority was called back in the 70s. He's tapped into that, and they're going to turn out in numbers. Even though they won't tell the pollsters that, they're really going to turn out in numbers.
And some of what he's tapped into, it's really hard to distinguish whether these are evangelical values or patriotic values or certain combination of both.
It really is. You know, there are a lot of evangelicals, myself included, who are upset that we have judges, as you mentioned the Supreme Court earlier, Stephen, that we have judges that make law from the bench. They're supposed to interpret law. You know, 60% of the people in North Carolina voted that marriage, a constitutional amendment, that marriage should be between a man and a woman. 60% of the people in this state that voted felt that way. One judge turned that around and turned it over. So it's no longer law of the land in the you know, a constitutional amendment should be hard to do away with. Right. But they're bothered by those kind of things, and they're especially frightened by the fact that there might be 3 justices in the next 5 years that would either retire or die. And they are frightened that the far left, and there's no question, I don't think, in anybody's mind that's supporting Hillary Clinton, that she has in this election moved much farther to the left than her husband was, or that she was up until a couple years ago. Really? They're afraid that she will be able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, which will affect us for the next 3 generations, not just the next election, but the next 3 generations.
Yeah, so it's really a combination of very complex issues.
Very complex.
I've got a couple of slides I want us all to take a look at together, if we could, just to get some numbers out here, and we can talk about it. Of course, this first one just indicates that a lot of people do tend to allow their religious commitments to enter into their decisions at the voting box. So if we could see the charts that follow this, and I don't think any of these charts will give a surprise to us here. These are from the Pew Research Center. Pew Research does some surveys about religious affiliation. This graph simply indicates that among white evangelical Protestants, there are significantly more Republicans, or the political identification among white evangelicals is significantly more toward the Republican end of the political spectrum than the Democratic, and that's no surprise, I think, for many of the reasons we've discussed. If we could see the next chart, please. This one might be a little more interesting. 78%. I think this reflects numbers from the end of July. I don't think they've changed a whole lot, though. 78% of white evangelical Protestants say they will be supporting Trump. 50% of white mainline Protestants, and again, there's some issues about differentiating between those. But look at the third category. 8% of black Protestants support Trump. Now, that's curious to me because as we were talking earlier, there are many black Protestants who would identify as evangelical. Is that right, Stephen? Jim? I mean,
yeah.
Yes, but this also is where we see the importance of when we define evangelical, not just sticking with what are oftentimes thought of as the explicitly religious issues, the doctrinal beliefs, but that people are complicated, of course. We don't tend to bifurcate our lives naturally just in terms of here's what I think theologically, here's what I think about my actual situation in life socially and politically. And so just to pick up on some of the points that Jim made, one of the things you might be seeing there is that even though if you were to stick with just doctrinal questions, what does your church believe, what do you religiously believe, you might have a larger percentage of African Americans who would identify as evangelical from that metric. From a different standpoint, when it comes to questions like which presidential candidate is likely to appoint Supreme Court justices or implement policies that are going to increase or decrease the level of discrimination that I face or that I feel, you'll have many African Americans think that a Trump presidency would be harmful to them, and that's why they might break for Senator Clinton. But the point here is that for them, it's unclear that they would necessarily say that this is voting against their evangelical beliefs. They would probably identify them as consonant with their evangelical beliefs, but that's because they're not necessarily separating what we call religion from what we're calling politics.
Right.
That's a good analogy. You know, look, we're complicated people. The black evangelicals believe basically in the core beliefs that the white evangelicals believe in. They believe in family, they believe in country, they believe in one man, one woman, and that's why it's so puzzling to me. The politics have gotten involved, and it becomes fuzzy to them as well as to the people looking as to how you separate their religious beliefs from their politics.
But what's interesting there, if you don't mind me jumping in, is one of the things that's going on there is that you're sort of making a selection of what counts as the core beliefs. And what you seem to be identifying, and this isn't just you, this is common among pollsters too, what seems to be commonly identified as core beliefs, those tend to reflect what white male evangelicals identify as core beliefs, whereas if you were to ask people whom we might want to identify as evangelicals who are Hispanic or African American, they might have a different idea of what counts as a core belief.
Well, they could, but I think all the polls show that the community across the spectrum believe in family, believe in country. You know, not just white male, but you know, my wife, a white female, she believes in the same core values that I do. It's a puzzle. It's a dichotomy because, you know, the unwed mothers in this country, it's about 80%, 75-80% of the unwed mothers in the black community with single mother children. It doesn't make a lot of sense because they believe strongly in the family, yet the numbers don't show it.
I guess it would be, if we can't even between the three of us come up with a kind of common definition of evangelicalism, to think that we could bring race and gender into the discussion and not complicate it.
That really complicates it.
It really complicates the matter.
Well, you look at that visual you showed, the white Catholic vote. You know, Catholics and Protestants are sometimes fighting with each other or not particularly liking each other.
Right.
But 50% of the white Catholics, you know, there are Catholic evangelicals. People don't understand that either.
And they are hardly ever included in the polls. It's
right.
really
They are hardly.
Protestant
You're right.
Evangelicals. In just a couple of minutes we have left, I'm curious, do you see any kind of, let's switch to Hillary Clinton here. Is there any kind of religious motivation among strong supporters of Hillary Clinton? In other words, do we see any kind of positive correlation between a particular religious perspective and a vote for Hillary Clinton, like we do between evangelicals and a vote for Donald Trump? Is there any sense that that's going on?
Well, if you were to go by watching the Democratic National Convention, how long ago was that? A few weeks ago, a month ago?
July sometime, yeah.
I mean, quite a few of the speakers were very explicit in invoking God or saying prayers, praying specifically to Jesus. They had repeated ministers praying. So on the one hand, it seems like Senator Clinton's campaign is very eager to identify with Christianity. On the other hand, this isn't surprising, but just because of the particular questions that tend to get asked in the media, it seems like most polling data tends to focus on Trump and evangelicals. So I don't know if we have as much data specifically to answer that question, but I think we can say that Senator Clinton's secretary, I guess she was a senator as well, Secretary Clinton's campaign has been very eager to articulate a message that is meant to resonate with Christians.
And it's, you know, both conventions, I happen to be able to attend the one in Cleveland. Both conventions, they're shows, that's all they are. But in the Democrat convention in particular, it was a show they put on. That has not been traditionally the message that the Democrat Party has put out to people. The ministers praying, the religious context, they did have one at their convention, no question about it. But they're consciously doing that because they see that vote out there.
Okay. Well, this is, you know, it's been fascinating. I think this program, which seeks to understand how religion affects our everyday life, this is the perfect program for this, as we try to understand how religious faith and commitments to values translate into how we vote and how we want to understand our country. So I appreciate both of you being here today. These are fascinating perspectives on this question. We could sit here for a couple of hours, I'm sure, but unfortunately we're out of time. But thank you
I
both.
applaud you for having us, Ozzie. You know, most people can't even explain to someone else what they believe.
Right.
It's hard to explain what other people believe.
Well, thank you for taking us a little further down that road. And I had to say, for this week, that's Religion and Life. And hope you'll join us next week. We're going to have a discussion about Hinduism in Appalachia, which will be another interesting topic. Until then, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Thank you.